The mind is trying to portray a full picture. The mind is trying to shape something whole, therefore increasing the usefulness of the prediction or the probability of a certain point of view or whatever it is. But it is a sort of aggregate of all of those senses. And in that way, it is a sort of master sense.
Is it not the kind of, not the brain, but the mind specifically, or the areas of the brain responsible for the mind? Is it not like an Intel chip? It's it's a processor of all the senses. It's a processor, it's information processing. Ultimately, when we talk about mind, or in any of our conversations on ego or sentience or the awareness, the I within you, Satan, we're talking about an information processing unit where all the senses are nodes, are portals of information to this core information processor.
Yeah, but
that you are rational. Or perhaps that's not really a great analogy, because the information processor isn't entirely mind.
you can look at it as the main information, the main chip, if you will, the main computational entity. I think it's not wrong.
I'm not sure I like it anymore.
But it's still useful, again, to think of it as a sense and think of senses as having a hierarchy where it's like you prioritize or you give precedence to something over another. And it's a highly sophisticated sense. Again, it's highly sophisticated in a different way. It's a lot younger than a lot of other senses.
Is it?
You've been hearing before you had a processor that aggregates, or before you had this sort of like a, yeah, but you could think of, again, that unicellular, that organism that's made of one cell. It doesn't have a brain, but it can still sense things. The sense itself comes before any type of aggregation.
How? Yeah, I don't know, because there is if there's a primitive sense of hearing and a primitive sense of seeing, there has to be a primitive sense of information processing.
Yeah, but
Because you're
information
grabbing that
processing-
information, the entity itself. It doesn't have to have a brain per se, but it has to. What's the point of having information coming in if you're not
Yeah, but
processing to respond to stimuli?
You're only processing. Again, there is some processing, because you're still using that sense to make a decision, to decide your next move. But what I mean is that it's not an aggregate. It starts with one sense. Again, think of that one cell. It only has one sense. It's like, where is there more glucose here than there is here? And it moves in that direction. It's not an aggregation of information. It's an input-output. It's one thing. Then you think of a more complex multicellular organism. Now it could get more information. Now it's going to need to start, it could start by processing information separately, but eventually it's going to need to start aggregating that
The
information.
separation
I don't even
separated
if
all,
that's even
all
possible.
senses, and even if it happened at the same time, let's say for,
Yeah.
for the sake of simplifying things, even if it's separated and you have a centralized mind processor and nodes of hardware that are providing you with information, they're still as young and old as each other. Because
Yeah.
they were one and then they split.
Possibly, maybe, yeah. Certainly the type of complexity that comes from the aggregation that is happening within our brains and within our minds is not only an outlier, but it's also a lot newer than everything else. That sense of, we're talking about the sense of self at this point, this sort of processor that aggregated so much data somehow led to a sort of self-reflecting entity. So that's the second thing I wanted to talk about, the mind. Not just that it was in a way the sort of master aggregator of all the senses, but that it actually has the ability somehow to look at itself, looking at the world. So it's not only looking at the world and making predictions, it's also looking at itself, which is quite, this is the outlier part. As far as we know, we're the only entity we're the only species on this planet at this point who can do this. You have a mind that sees itself looking at the world. And it's a key factor, and that's part of what I mean by it's younger. That entity, that ability at least, is a lot younger than all of our other senses. That we've been sensing the world for billions of years.
Louis, you stay with me, baby.
We've been sensing the world. We've been navigating through this earth, through this planet, through all the obstacles for 4 billion years. We've only been looking at ourselves doing it. I'm exaggerating.
That's a big... No, it's not that bad of an exaggeration.
Yeah, it's a worthy exaggeration.
Yeah.
But we've only been looking at ourselves doing it for a few hundred...
Thousand?
Yeah, a few 100,000 years. So definitely a very young
But that's
sense.
a targeting of a Homo sapien, and we are the only entities we know of because we're the only entities that survived from some.
That's why I said right now. But I agree,
yeah,
but it seems like it's part of our blueprint.
It happened somewhere.
Our human cousins most likely had that blueprint as well. It's not unreasonable to actually. It's unreasonable to think otherwise.
Suggest otherwise.
Yeah,
they
it
had
just doesn't
some
make sense.
other states of ego.
Absolutely.
But I still think it's hard to make that distinction, and that's because not only because we're the only ones now, and we could have had other human cousins that have surpassed a certain point of this singularity, if you will, of somewhere down our ancestral trail, the sentience has reached a level of complexity where it became aware of self. You had self-awareness, not just self, but awareness of self. A mind that it actually, a voice started whispering within you, and you're familiar with it. And I think in one of our takes we talked about that moment when we tried to speculate when it happened down our, like that moment of Adam, if you will, when that first entity that started waking up with the sense of self-awareness. But we talked about it not being a gray area because it's hard to define. And the reason it's hard to define is because whatever arbitrary point you put, the moment right before is not an existence absent of sentience, absent of that processor, absent of some primitive sense of mind. Just like vision, our ancestors, even ancestors that still exist today, or cousins from ancestors we share still exist today, we know that they have a sense of vision. But we still don't quite understand what vision means without sentience. What does it mean to see without interpreting?
I mean,
What
you're
does it mean-
interpreting. You are interpreting the data.
Without the sentient, without the awareness of this interpretation.
I mean, there's an obstacle in front of me. I have to jump. That's an
Understood.
interpretation.
But there's a rationalization that exists that we struggle to take away from the interpretation and therefore reaction to stimuli. A dog doesn't necessarily have that rationalization. They just react to stimuli, and they need to use their visual input.
Yeah, but in a
there
way,
is an information processor without necessarily sentience having crossed that threshold. But we don't know what it means for a dog to see. We know what it means for us to see because we can rationalize what it means to see.